Hello, and welcome to Doctor Who 50 Years Ago, the show that looks back to the episode that aired in 1966 and looks at what's different between then and now. This week, The Highlanders, Episode 1, by Elwyn Jones and Derry Davis. I am Ben.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Nick.
Here we are, here we go, into the news from 1966. Immediately we're into space. Sunday, December the 11th. NASA releases the first photograph to show almost the entire disk of the Earth, done by the ATS-1 satellite that was launched the previous week.
So is this sort of like, when you say disk of the Earth, do you mean like similar to the blue marble photograph?
I think so. Yes.
Okay.
That's the quote. The entire disk of the Earth.
So this is the farthest they've managed to get a probe out and be able to look back and take a photograph of the Earth at this point.
I think it was 230,000 miles.
Okay.
Yeah, it showed basically, let's say, a third of the disk, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe half.
Well,
it didn't get as far as Europe, but it definitely had the entirety of North and South America and things like that.
Oh, okay.
On Monday, December the 12th, Breakfast at Tiffany's, a musical based on the best-selling book by Truman Capote, opened on Broadway for a preview and became one of the more memorable flops in theatre history. It was apparently extremely boring and closed after 4 performances.
I guess what this shows is adaptations have always been a hit and miss. You know, sometimes they can be really good, but also flop. Even if the source material is good, depends how you interpret it. Yeah, or when Doctor Who's translated to movie form, that wasn't necessarily so successful.
No, it was quirky, to say the least. Or it's just terrible, like a certain 2016 BBC One series. Right. The difference between then and now. Not much.
No.
On Tuesday, December the 13th, the US Department of Defense confirmed that a US Air Force pilot was being held captive in China, having been shot down or had a mechanical failure on September 20th, 1965.
Oh, this is the much less famous U2 crisis, is it?
Pretty much, yeah, because China said, we've got an Air Force pilot. The US said, no, you haven't, until now. For literally over a year. So,
bloody hell. That must have been sucky, being in a Chinese prison in the 60s.
Yes.
Especially good adjective, Nick. Sucky is, I imagine, the word he put in his memoirs.
When he came home and was interviewed by the CIA and the FBI, what was it like, son? Sucky. Yeah, thanks. Moving away from China to Russia, on Wednesday, December the 14th, not that we learnt it on this day, the launch of the second unmanned Soyuz rocket ended disastrously when one of the boosters on the rocket was not able to reach the required minimal thrust. The automatic escape system activated, and the rocket exploded on the launch pad, killing at least 1 technician.
Well, I guess this is showing that although a lot of progress is being made in the space race on both sides of the Cold War, there are casualties. And
oh, yes.
If you want to progress that quickly, you're going to have some problems, and this is one of those things. But it doesn't derail the whole program.
Saturn! On Thursday, December the 15th, Janus, one of the moons of Saturn, was first identified under a different name, which I can't remember currently.
Well, it's surprising that they were still finding moons as recently as 50 years ago.
It was not officially named until 1983. By giving it a name that's steeped in Western culture, by Janus being the god of January, and by being part of the Latin heritage, they're claiming it with their culture by naming him that.
It would be interesting in Doctor Who if they landed on a planet and they go and subvert the Roman naming categories by calling it, oh no, it's not called Roma or Venus, it's called
Skitchinov.
That's it. Yes.
It seems that the people here, Doctor, they all seem to be speaking Russian. Well, well, my dear boy, maybe we just don't know. Maybe it was not supposed to be called Janus after all. Maybe.
And finally, on Friday, December the 16th, the impasse continues between the UK and Rhodesia. By an 11-0 vote, the United Nations Security Council approves an oil embargo and other economic sanctions against Rhodesia. France and the Soviet Union abstained. And that was the news. And now we shall get into the Highlanders episode 1. Thoughts, gentlemen?
This is the episode which turned me off of Doctor Who completionism. Even though I love Classic Who, when I watched this episode the first time a while ago, I thought, this is a barrel that does not need to be scraped, and I don't want the infection that I'm going to get as a result of doing that. That's how much I dislike the Highlanders Part 1.
I'm going to say Revenge of the Smugglers, pretty much. Yeah, it's come back to haunt us, this historical rubbish. This is the longest 25 minutes I've had since having to watch an episode of The Smugglers. Ugh.
We have here the second historical done wrong. The only reason that we were invested for this 25 minutes was literally so we could talk about it in this podcast, I believe. Otherwise, it's just completely unappealing for many reasons which we shall get into. So, we open on a massacre in Scotland. No, it's not a Friday night. This is the English Redcoats and some rebel Scotsman Jacobites doing their thing for about a minute and a half. Despite what you say, this isn't some colonists versus colonials. No, it's a battle over the royal bloodline. Honest.
It was setting up the tone of a more action-based serial against the slow burn political thing of the last one. But this action scene is very oddly placed. I feel like it was there to trick us
yes.
into watching the whole thing.
Oh goodness me, yes. It's a reverse of the Smugglers. All the action ends in part 4 in the Smugglers, whereas it's literally from second 1 after the opening titles.
The thing is, then after that, it's all very talky, pretty much. They're either in that little house or they're in the field outside the house, or there's a cave at the very end as well.
Yeah, all running about on film. Yeah.
It's getting the kids, isn't it?
Yeah, it would have got kids on board. People would have looked up from the ironing and thought, "Ooh, here's something going on." There was the Daleks last week killing everyone. And here's going to be some Scottish people killing people.
It's riding on the coattails of Power of the Daleks. Get off. In the middle of this massacre, the Ben and Polly and the Doctor arrive. Ben and Polly are almost killed by cannon fire, which the people watching going, damn, missed. The Doctor, resplendent in a hat and coat, because why not, pokes this cannonball with a stick, and then they continue on towards this battlefield to stop a wandering Ben from straying into battlefield and getting himself killed like an idiot.
He does something very undoctorish, is that he tries to leave.
Run away!
Yeah, and I think that's a forced and quite misguided attempt to make this Doctor different from the last one, because it's so undoctorish. Especially when we look at the Smugglers, of him not really having a reason to stay, but he does anyway.
Yeah, this is definitely the result of differing minds at the production office fighting over how best to run the show, not realising that the entire show is at stake. Colin the Laird moans in a loud fashion, because he's quite wounded, I think, whilst Kirsty, Alexander, and some guy called Jamie hide in a cottage from the massacre. The Scottish argue amongst themselves about the failures at Culloden. Scottish joke number 7. The Doctor, Ben and Polly are spotted and brought in, having inspected the abandoned field gun, because history, and the Highland bonnet hats of Bonnie Prince Charlie, probably.
When you said some guy called Jamie,
Mhm.
that is
Literally it.
absolutely
Who
who
Yeah.
he is. He just turns up. It's
Yeah, he's actually one of the least. He's not that doesn't make him out to be important, does it?
Least developed character with the most Scottish accent, despite being the most English actor.
And also, obviously, having never seen this and only seeing his late, when he's a full-time companion, his voice accent here is quite jarring.
I think it shows of the Innes Lloyd era on what sort of chicken rotisserie the companions operated on. Because people could be picked up and dropped off at will. And if they liked you, you were a companion now. Your contract was up, well, you're often the faceless ones, whether it makes sense or not.
After being mistaken for the Duke of Cumberland's forces, the Doctor's party is saved by Kirsty outcrying that the Doctor is a doctor, he could save Colin the Laird. And in the ensuing confusion, Ben snatches a pistol and disarms everybody else. The Doctor is able to assess Colin. Polly and Kirsty get water for Colin, and thus that's how the group is separated. The Doctor and Ben charm Alexander and Jamie, but the gun goes off when thrown away in a sort of farcical manner, which attracts the English to the cottage.
So they're in the middle of a battle, and then they can hear one gunshot from inside a cottage, and clearly all the English army comes down on it. That's just silly.
Become our main villains, Lieutenant Finch, spelt with 2 S, because why not, and his sergeant. The latter, at least, is more than happy to kill anything that isn't English. Alexander goes for the martyrdom route and bravely charges them and is shot down, which is the entire episode in a nutshell. Finch and the sergeant suspects all of them to be rebels, and the Doctor fails to fool them with a terrible German accent and joke. They're taken out to be hanged.
I know you've sort of touched it already, but
Yeah.
there's a specific line: rebels are not to be treated as prisoners of war. So I was thinking maybe this is a reference to Britain's ruthless treatment of
because if they're
rebellions in let's say Kenya, I think in particular.
Still Rhodesia.
Well, Rhodesia as well, but I think I know specifically of Kenya a few years earlier. Was it the Maori?
The Mau Mau crisis. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, and things I've heard about that the British Army were very ruthless, to put it politely.
The King's men, they run in and they shout, "Surrender in the King's name!" But, at least from the telesnaps, it looks like there's just one of them. It's this terrible damp squib, and the Doctor manages to convince them that he's German within the space of about 15 seconds with no proper accent. And it's such a terrible, feeble representation of the King's English. And I think it's very reminiscent of how jokey and awful looking England as an empire must be looking at the time, because the British Empire was crumbling by this point. And we also saw this sort of thing in The Smugglers when the King's men all ran in, and it was all very twee and quaint and very old past historical territory.
Enter Solicitor Graham Perkins, who were just behind the lines, watching the battle. They eat and show themselves to be gluttonous English folk, and basically tell the entire audience how they wish to sell the Scottish as slaves to work in the colonies and coin the profit from it. With Trask, who we assume is a sailor man, in on the deal.
They introduce Grey as being this wealthy, maybe not upper class, maybe more like upper middle class, and he's trying to get more money so that he can work his way up. But he's not very pleasant, although outwardly he appears very respectable, etc., etc. But he's talking about very unsavory things like slaves. So that's kind of a bit of a stereotype of your upper class villain, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
And then he's got a servant who is quite dim-witted and isn't that well spoken. So it's clearly working class. So you've got a very much a sort of stereotype of a upper class villain and a stereotype of a working class servant. So class here is this is probably, I think, just a lazy writing technique for them.
Absolutely.
At the time, just he's poor, he's rich, so one's smart, one's stupid. It's lazy. I don't think it's
a lazy hierarchy, which we can assume can only be reversed in episode 4 or earlier, depending on how quickly this episode runs out of steam.
Yeah, and I think, considering the time that the writers of this would have grown up in, this and for the country at large, the audience watching it, the class system was so entrenched, and in some ways it still is entrenched now, but even more so in the 60s. This would you would go, oh, this is normal, whatever.
Kirsty and Polly watch the hanging taking place from a distance. They try to create a diversion, drawing Finch towards them, onto film, and away from the rest of the episode entirely. This is because, history lesson time, folks, Bonnie Prince Charlie, head of the Jacobite clan, trying to restore the family to the throne, is rumoured to be running away dressed as a woman. And there's 2 women there. Of course we're going to go running away after them. Despite protocol, the sergeant starts the hanging. All 5 seconds of moving footage that there is for the entire episode. But in come Gray and Perkins, who stop the hanging, interfering and choosing the doctor's party to be slaves.
This is the second trick of the episode. When I was watching this, and I heard the countdown to the hanging, and then I heard the drum roll, I thought, oh my god, this episode passed quickly. We're about to have the cliffhanger. Wow. And then I looked, and it was 12 minutes in. Exactly halfway through. This episode tricks you once again by having a punt fake cliffhanger. You could put that sequence at a cliffhanger and you'd say, yeah, that's the cliffhanger. And then, don't you know about Article 17 of the Aliens Act? And that's the resolution. And that's the resolution to it. But instead, it's as though it's saying, look up again halfway through. It's trying to keep you interested, but instead of trying to do interesting things, it's just plugging them in at checkpoints. And it's an underhanded tactic, and it doesn't work brilliantly, in my opinion.
Yes,
No.
It's creating the illusion of pace, which it fails miserably. It does not have pace.
Yes. It has, ooh, I'm alive again. This is feeling weird. And then you forget about that, and you go into your comatose state of drooling while the Highlanders plays in front of you. But it doesn't feel like TV. It just looks like noise with picture.
Yes. We can always rely on you for your Orwellian landscapes, Luke. Thanks very much. So the Doctor saves his, Jamie's and Colin's necks by impersonating a foreigner and quoting law to the solicitor. He manages to recognise the solicitor through, I can only assume, a Sherlock scan, or through convenience. And they're sent to Inverness prison en route to be sold as slaves, just as planned. Kirsty and Polly hide in a cave, and they eat one biscuit between them. They sort of build up a relationship between them by planning to buy the Doctor out of jail, but then that collapses spectacularly. Kirsty's ring, a familial ring, or at least a ring in the family, is the cause of a terrible argument, with the younger and extremely brash Polly storming off the loser and promptly falling down a trap because she's a fool. And then she's menaced by a pointy thing, and that's the cliffhanger.
Yeah, and this bit I find interesting. Polly says to the Highlander woman, after talking about some anachronistic things like fillings and matches, which are always going to confuse the poor Highland woman, she then says, "Oh, you're just a stupid peasant," in a really sneery tone. And Polly is definitely implied more of upper class person from the 60s. So it's quite interesting that she just sneers at this poor woman from Scotland in the 18th century. It's very out of character, and I think sort of shows us what the writer thinks, really, more than anything else.
I would argue that something has gone terribly wrong and in the script writing by two male script writers. I'm going to argue this on a feminist sexist perspective.
Oh, I see, okay.
That this has suddenly turned into one hell of a weird catfight.
Yeah, and as cliffhangers go, that's a pretty rubbish cliffhanger.
Falls down a hole, is menaced by a pointy thing, yes.
It literally comes out of nowhere. At least the hanging is built up over like a few minutes. This just literally comes out of nowhere. It's rubbish.
Yeah.
This bit feels like, oh no, we've got to the end of 25 minutes. We need to have a cliffhanger. What can we do? She falls down a hole.
I almost wonder if it's supposed to be comedic.
If it is meant to be comedy, then it's completely tonal whiplash. In this, a story about the Highlanders being massacred by the English. Why are you trying to put bits of comedy into it, then?
Like the Dr.
And if you're doing it, you're not doing it very well. Dr. von Ver, the terrible German accent.
Yeah, I know. You even get literally the comment Doctor Who. It's always cringe-worthy when that's done.
Which 50 years later will not go away.
I always, literally, other than in An Unearthly Child, I always cringe at when they say Doctor Who. That's a question.
When I saw that I thought, oh, she's putting so much emphasis on the ring. It must be about how life expectancy is so low that the father doesn't care about death. He cares more about his legacy. That's interesting. That's an interesting perception of the time. And then I thought, that can't be right. This serial hasn't been that smart. And then I looked back and I saw my cliffhanger point that I made. And my point since then, for the last 12 minutes of the episode, were just two lines that I liked. One of which we've discussed, and the other was, biscuits are not fit for dogs. About dog biscuits. And if we look over our synopsis and what we've summed up, we've basically got nothing since the hanging as well. This episode does nothing. There is so little idea behind it. It peters out halfway through and has got nothing.
You can sum this up as an uninteresting run around in a field. It's trying to inject life into a corpse.
Yes. And
the corpse of
Jones.
The corpse of an 18th century Highlander. It's not going to happen, guys. Your point about Elwyn Jones?
He's got nothing. He's trying something in some places. In other places, he's trying something else, I think, but nothing works.
No.
I think in 3 weeks' time, our post-mortem about him is going to be very interesting. One, we need to discover who he is. And two, we need to discover exactly why.
I feel bad judging him on this because it's so terrible.
Yeah. We need to see if there's anything good he's done. Or at least objectively good. Thank goodness we're only doing it 1 week at a time. Is the essence of Doctor Who 50 years ago. Thank you very much for watching. You can find us on Blogspot, which redirects to iTunes, where you can comment and rate us. We're also on Facebook and YouTube, where you can like, comment and subscribe, and other internety things, including Google+, if you dare. We shall be back next week in the still quite cold and probably still boring Scotland with episode 2 of the Highlanders. Until then, I have been Ben.
I have been Luke.
And I've been Nick.
Thank you, and goodbye.